All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Brian Croser. It's October 15th, 2024 here in the US. It is October 16th, 2024 in Australia, where Brian is joining us from. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Rich, it's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Excellent. First question, get things started. Why wine?
Well, it was a pretty easy decision and made very early in my educational career while I was still at secondary school, high school. So I made the decision to be a winemaker before I could legally taste wine. I had a headmaster at the school I went to, which is called Scotch College, who was the son of the Red Archbishop of Canterbury, and he'd been a headmaster in Zimbabwe before he came to Australia and became headmaster of my school. And he loved wine. He loved Australian red wine in copious quantities. But he was a biologist and had a deep interest in viticulture and winemaking. And he encouraged me to think along those lines. I came off a farm in a winemaking area, the Clare Valley, but my farm didn't have any vines. It was all about sheep, my family farm. But over the hill, there were lots of vines. So I knew about winemaking. I knew it existed, and my parents drank a little bit of sweet sherry and occasionally a fizzy wine. But when I got to secondary school and got the encouragement of this headmaster, I decided to become a winemaker and not a soil scientist or an agricultural scientist in the general sense of the word that I had intended to be. Anyway, that's how I got started. I'd had to make a decision about what I would do at university, my tertiary degree. There was Roseworthy Agriculture College, which is a tertiary institution, but at certificate level, not degree level, for the teaching of enology, spelled with an O here, by the way, O-E, enology in the proper Greek way, and viticulture. And that was the institution that turned out most of Australia's winemakers. I didn't want to go there. It wasn't scientific enough. I wanted to understand the basis of the biological, chemical basis of viticulture and winemaking. So I decided to do agricultural science instead. The agricultural science degree at the University of Adelaide is one of the best in the world and always has been. And I managed to land with a professor who had a profound interest in viticulture, even though viticulture wasn't taught as a separate subject at the university. It was taught as horticulture, part of horticulture. And Dr. Brian Croser was very, very special viticulturalist who's well recognised as, he's dead now, but as having made a huge contribution to Australian viticulture and winemaking. So I studied under him and a number of other really wonderful teachers in soil science, microbiology, biochemistry, and obviously plant physiology, all the things that really are the foundation stones for viticulture and enology studies. So having entered the ag science degree, I had to think about where I was going to work when I came out, because I wouldn't have a viticulture or enology specific qualification. And I met with a man who was trying to take his company up market out of the fortified wine business into the fine table wine business. And that was Tom Hardy of Thomas Hardy and Sons, a company founded in the 1850s, family company. I met with him. He liked the idea of having, I guess, somebody from an unconventional background, but with a scientific bent. He was an engineer himself. And I said, the condition on which I'll work for you, which is pretty cheeky, is that if I work for you and solve these problems that you have, you'll send me off to do a master's degree at the University of California, Davis. Brian Croser, the man I talked to you about, Professor Brian Croser, had just been on a sabbatical to Davis and came back and shared with me what a wonderful institution it was and what a pantheon of great teachers, Amarine, Winkler, Olmo, all of the wonderful teachers, a generation that won't ever be repeated because they were all such great viticulturists and enologists. So that's, I put the proposition to him. He looked at me and he said, "Yep, you solve the problems and I'll send you off to Davis." And so we had a deal. He had enormous problems in Thomas Hardy and Sons with hygiene, bottling hygiene, and the problems of re-fermentation in bottle, lots of problems of volatile acid in the red cellars, and problems of oxidation with white wines. And I started in 1970, the beginning of 1970. And by the time that I left to go to Davis, I'd solved most of those problems, which was in early 1972. So within 2 years, I'd solved those problems as Thomas Hardy and Sons Chief Quality Control Officer. So then I had been married before I went to Davis, and Anne and I flew to Davis on a very circuitous route, and ended up in the married students' quarters there called Orchard Park. Made some lifelong friends who we still go and visit, and they come and visit us. And worked with that wonderful generation of professors at Davis, unrepeatably good, and became friends with them all, and really enjoyed my time at Davis. We obviously explored California from top to bottom, and a little bit of Arizona and Nevada, but didn't get much further than that. And part of our exploration was to find a variety I had nothing to do with in Australia, because there was hardly any. There were just 2 small vineyards, one in Mudgee and one in the Hunter Valley, residual vineyards from the introduction by James Busby in 1832 of Chardonnay. So Chardonnay became part of our lives, and we drank as many Chardonnays and as much Chardonnay as we could find, which was quite a lot. And we made a decision that when we got back to Australia, we would find the absolute perfect spot for Chardonnay and find some Chardonnay rootlings, which were very rare in Australia. And we'd make a Chardonnay, despite the fact I was still working for, obviously, Thomas Hardy and Sons. When I came back, I was put in charge of white wine making at Hardy's, and that was in 1974. And in 1975, we basically swept the pool of the Australian wine shows with our white wines, because I eliminated all the oxidation and introduced all sorts of technologies, including yeast technology and my own yeast strains, which were very, very, very aromatic, very, very clean fermentations. And those wines still are sort of legendary, I guess, from 1975 and 1974. So I'd achieved all the things that Thomas Hardy wanted me to achieve. And he basically said, "Oh, next step is you're going to be the head winemaker." And I knew what head winemaker meant. It meant sitting at the desk and running a whole lot of other winemakers who do the hard work, or not the hard work, do the things I wanted to do, the interesting things. Because with just 5 years of experience behind me, I knew there was a lot more I had to find out about vineyards and about winemaking. So I went to him and said, "Look, I've just seen an advertisement for a lectureship at Roseworthy. I'd like to apply for that job. I think I've done my job here." I couldn't go to another company, obviously, because I'd been supported by Thomas Hardy and Sons through my Davis stint. And he said, "Yeah, I can understand what you're saying to me, that you need to be more hands-on viticulture and winemaking for a lot longer, if not for the whole of your life," which is really what I wanted. And he said, but I wouldn't go to Roseworthy. It's too old-fashioned and too stuck in its ways. There's a new course being set up in Wagga Wagga in New South Wales at the Riverina College of Advanced Education, later to be called Charles Sturt University. Why don't you apply for the job there as the first lecturer and write the courses and create something? So I did. And I dragged our 1-year-old daughter and my wife off to Wagga Wagga, which is in the Never Never of Australia, and have been reminded of it ever since, constantly. And I set up a teaching winery, which wasn't on the agenda at all, but I did, which became an instant show winning winery. Lots of the wines we made were won gold medals and trophies at the wine show, so it became instantly recognisable. And I wrote the 5 courses of the winemaking course, being taught by correspondence and full-time on campus, but mostly by correspondence to students all around Australia. So it was quite a busy time up until the end of 1978. So I started this at the end of 1976. Sorry, I started this at the beginning of 1976 and ended up at the end of 1978, having started the winery and having written the courses for what is now the wine science course at Charles Sturt University. I left because we found the perfect place to grow Chardonnay, which is in the Adelaide Hills in the Piccadilly Valley, low region 1, heat summation, 40-inch rainfall, mostly in the winter, on very old soils, 750 million year old soils, most of it. But the place we chose is a 1.8 billion year old geology that has turned into some lovely red soil over a cracking clay. And this particular property, which is about 25 acres, had an old cottage on it, built in the 1890s. We moved our family, we by then had another daughter, so we moved our 2 daughters from Wagga, much to the pleasure of my wife, who breathed a big sigh of relief as we drove out of the town of Wagga back to Piccadilly Valley, because all our families lived in Adelaide, and Piccadilly Valley is 25 minutes from the centre of Adelaide. I was looking at northern Tasmania, and I was looking at Mount Macedon in Victoria as places for Chardonnay. Pretty much the Piccadilly Valley was the same in climate to both those places, and had the advantage that it was our hometown and our families were very close by. In fact, my parents actually lived in the Piccadilly Valley. So there's some coincidence, but there's also a lot of deliberation in terms of choosing the Piccadilly Valley as a place to grow Chardonnay. That's how we got to be where we are. And we'd started a company called Petaluma, so named after the town in California, as our backup while I was working for Thomas Hardy and Sons. We were looking for a name from our Californian experience because it was so life-defining for us. The A's won 3 World Series in a row, and we were great A's fans and went down to the Coliseum and watched them, and I can name the teams even now. But we'd started this company called Petaluma, named after the town just north of San Francisco on the Petaluma Gap. And the criterion was it had to be a wonderful Californian name, and there should be no grapes grown there. And there weren't. But now it's probably the hottest grape growing region in the Sonoma area of California. So our selection was appropriate at the time, but it has since looked a bit like plagiarism, a little bit like stealing a name from California. That company, we made our first wines while I was still working at Charles Sturt. and consulting to a number of people around Australia. Our first wine was a Riesling from down on the Goulburn River in Victoria, from a place called Mitchelton, where I was acting as a consultant. And our second and third wines were a Gewürztraminer, which we call the cash flow wine, and a Chardonnay out of central New South Wales, out of a recently planted vineyard, because Chardonnay was the hot thing in 77. You couldn't get cuttings, you couldn't get rootlings. Every ton of Chardonnay around Australia was spoken for 2 and 3 times over. So I was lucky that I befriended the viticulturalist at this Cowra vineyard, which is in central New South Wales, and we were the closest winery at Wagga Wagga, and we made Wagga Wagga, as in Charles Sturt University, Riverina College, Chardonnay, which won gold medals throughout the wine shows, and we also made a Petaluma Chardonnay in 1977, which was the first Petaluma Chardonnay. Our ambition was not to make warm climate Chardonnay, like Cara is quite warm, high region 3 in the Winkler system, but it was the only Chardonnay available. And our ambition was to make Chardonnay from the appropriate cool climate, as preached by Harold Olmeyer and preached by Winkler and Weaver and all of the great viticultural teachers that I was taught by, and Amarine, of course, as an enologist. You have to go to a cool, damp climate to grow Chardonnay properly, and that's what we chose, was the Piccadilly Valley. I took the partnership a character called Len Evans, who owned a restaurant in Sydney and started a winery called Rothbury in the Hunter Valley. And Len was Mr. Wine Australia, a Welshman who came to Australia, and he had the back page of the Australian newspaper for quite a long time. He wrote about wine. He was a publicist. And a man of incredible knowledge about fine wine, and he drank the best and rarest. And in those days, you could find wines from the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, and they didn't cost a fortune. They cost a lot, but they were available and you could buy them. And he drank a lot of those, and I was right there alongside him, drinking them with him, because what an experience. He became a very, very good friend and a mentor. And I was fortunate throughout my life to have lots of good mentors, including one of the finest was Cal Knudsen. So he had just bought for his company a couple of properties in Bordeaux, Chateau Raoul and Chateau Padouen, and he'd bought a vineyard in Coonawarra in South Australia, Cabernet country, south of here, south of the Piccadilly Valley by about 3.5 hours, and a Riesling vineyard in Clare, which is the home of Riesling for Australia, alongside Eden Valley. And he needed somebody to make the wines from his Coonawarra and his Clare vineyards. I put my hand up and said, I'll make the wines if you build a winery at my property in the Piccadilly Valley. And he said, deal done. So we sold him a piece of land at the bottom of our Piccadilly Valley estate and built a winery to start in 1979 vintage, managing his Coonawarra vineyard and managing his Clare vineyard for Riesling, and making our wines from still the Cowra Chardonnay in central New South Wales. We shipped the juice over from the college, in fact. That was the beginning of a very, very long and fruitful, I won't say profitable, fruitful relationship. He was a great man and a great raconteur and fun to be with. Maybe we take a break there and you might have some things you might want to ask or whatever, but it was the beginning of the Evans Wine Company, and there's a lot more adventure coming.
I like that. That's a nice little teaser for what's to come. Yeah, so I have a couple questions and then we'll catch back up there, or we'll pick up with Evans Wine Company there. I want to start with your kind of the first work you did. You mentioned going to Hardy and seeing all of the issues that were there. Tell me about diving into a problem like that, where you have a production that has issues like that, that has re-fermentation, that has bottling hygiene issues. How do you attack a problem like that, and how did you get it solved and online so quickly?
Fairly straightforward, really, because it's quite obvious the bottling machine was not being sterilized properly, and it was quite obvious that the bottling machinery was defective in that it had traps for microorganisms and things like that. So I said about they were chemically sterilizing the bottling machine, which in itself is a terrible thing. It contaminates wine and it's not effective. So first principles from food science at Davis came into play, and I instituted a whole new cleaning program for the bottling equipment, including the use of metasilicate and citric acid solutions. Professor Michael Lewis, who started all the mini breweries, microbreweries in those days, he was the professor of brewing at Davis. Great man, another mentor. He taught brewery hygiene. So I borrowed those techniques, and instead of using chemical sterilization, I got the company to buy a water boiler that could deliver copious hot water, 90 degrees centigrade plus, which is nearly boiling point, to the bottling machine. And then I set up a whole lot of filtration equipment that meant that the wine that was going to the bottling machine was actually properly sterilized through pads and membranes. And when it got to the bottling machine was clean, and the wine went to bottle and stayed there. The worst part was the bag and boxes that they were filling. They were filling those plastic bag and box, and a lot of sweet wine in those that re-fermented. And if you've ever seen one of those blow up with fermentation gas and a whole stack of them on a pallet, all leaning crazily, and occasionally one would pop and the pallet would collapse, and it was an embarrassing mess and a very costly mess, and we solved all of those problems. The bigger problem, longer term problem, that was easy, and I set up some laboratory techniques where every morning before we started the bottling machine, we would take the first sample, stop the bottling, go to the laboratory, filter the first bottle through a membrane, and then put a stain on the membrane, and then look at it through the microscope. And immediately obvious would be any yeast cells that were there, and invariably there weren't. On an occasion there were. So it stopped the bottling, which really made us popular with the whole production hierarchy. Anyway, we did solve the problem. They did have a bigger problem, which was winemaking in those days was all about the winery, and mostly about fortified wine and making brandy. So nobody in the wineries visited the vineyards. The first sight they got of the grapes was when the grape came across the weighbridge on the way in to be tipped into the crusher. Well, I took it back a step, and we really began to monitor the vineyards from the time of bud burst right through to the time of harvest, and to do sampling of the grapes to ascertain the level of maturity. And I've set up a whole protocol for that, which we still use exactly the same as I set it up then, and separate the juice from a sample that's separated in a way that is representative of what happens in the winery, and then analyze that and taste that and work out how far you've got to go to vintage, or whether it's the time to pick. And Tom Hardy loved that. It took it back to the vineyard, and I hired a new generation of younger winemakers who'd done ag science with me and were doing Roseworthy as an add-on to the ag science, so they had the fundamental science as well. So I hired those people. So when I went off to Wagga Wagga, in place were a whole new generation of winemakers at Thomas Hardy and Sons, and they were tuned into the vineyard. They were tuned into the quality control at the at the bottling process, and into protecting the wines from oxidation and from the red wines from being acidified in barrels. So, yeah.
Absolutely. That's so interesting to me, especially the part about the separation between winery and vineyard. Such an
Mm,
interesting to think it wasn't that long ago that the fruit just sort of appeared one day and no thought was given to what was
mm,
happening in the vineyard before that.
yeah.
Tell me a little bit about you mentioned your time at Davis and being so kind of life altering for you. Tell me about some of the sort of the favorite memories there, coursework or people you met or adventures in California, and tell me about what it was about Chardonnay that got you so excited to pursue that as a life passion.
Well, Davis is not far from San Francisco, and San Francisco then, and I think now, is just such a marvelous city. And we spent a lot of time in San Francisco, and our friends that were doing one of them doing the Davis course was sort of royalty in San Francisco, so we got to see all the best places. Um, Restaurants, sightseeing, down to Yosemite, uh, all the wonderful things that you can do in that part of Northern California that uh, is uniquely Northern Californian. And we became sort of partly Northern Californians and have remained so for the rest of our lives, including barracking, as we call it, for the A's. Um, Davis itself was pretty agricultural town, and it was dry. You couldn't purchase alcohol of any sort in the town precinct. And in fact, the university enology department was basically breaking the town ordinance by making and tasting wine on site. But they did have some pretty good bottle shops just over the boundary of the township on the outskirts. Um, so Davis itself, we developed some very strong friendships. You know, Darryl Corty in Sacramento, Corty Brothers. He's a god of food and wine. I got him to come down to Davis and give us tastings of his Italian and Spanish wines that he specialized in. And he's a lifelong friend, still is, very much in communication. People like Robert Mondavi became a very firm friend. Zelma Long from Simi, who had been Mondavi's chief winemaker, very firm friend. We made friends with lots of the winemakers, Freemark Abbey, Joseph Phelps, Stony Hill, some name, Freemark Abbey I've already mentioned. Maya Karmas, where an Australian winemaker was stationed, all around the Napa and Sonoma Valley, basically. And a few of the students that were alongside me have ended up making wine there, and they were good friends. David Stair at Dry Creek, and Gary Eberly who introduced Shiraz down San Luis Obispo, I think, you know, on the Californian coast, Southern Californian coast. So it was but the most enriching thing of all was rubbing shoulders every day with Albert Winkler, with Maynard Amarin, with Cornelius O, with Harold Olmo, who'd just been to Australia 20 years before, and listening to them talk about the philosophies of growing fine table wine grapes, especially Chardonnay, and making fine table wine. Oh, I should mention Andrei Chelachev was a very, very good friend, a legendary winemaker from BV, and he came to visit us in Australia, and I became a consultant to him when he was doing work up in Washington State at Chateau Saint Michel. He was the consultant there. I did some consulting on with him later after Davis. So that was the main stimulus for me. And my wife, she was a biochemist, geneticist, and she worked in genetics and biochemistry with a fellow called Trout, who had worked with Watson and Crick. So the discoverers of the mitochondrial spiral. So it was, as I say, life defining. And we made up our minds that we would be going back and back and back and back to Davis, to Northern California. In fact, that probably leads into going back in 1980 for the centenary of the Davis, what was the research institute set up out of Berkeley, Agricultural Research Institute set up out of Berkeley, that they had a big centenary celebration in 1980. So Anne and I went back for that. And they had a tasting set up around the swimming pool of Oregon wines. All of the current Oregon producers of the time, Dave Adelsheim, David Lett, all of those people. There would have been maybe 8 to 10 producers. And I tasted, despite the smell of chlorine coming off the swimming pool at Davis, we tasted those wines and I thought, yep, this is cool climate stuff. It wasn't great. It was a bit thin and acidic and lacking a bit of colour and a bit of phenol. But they had cool climate fruit characters and cool climate acid and balance. And I thought this is for us. A girl who came from Adelaide, a friend of Anne's family, was studying ag science at Davis, not winemaking. And she introduced us to her boyfriend of the time, who was a very rowdy Texan who was actually studying enology and viticulture, whose name Roland Soles. So we got to know Roland over the chlorine and Oregon wines at the Davis swimming pool at the University of California Davis swimming pool. So I first met him, and then he wrote to me looking for a vintage job in Australia, and the rest is history, as we say. We sort of touched on 1980, and I've started the Evans Wine Company winery in 1978, ready for the 1979 vintage in March, February, March, April. And I've been sent off to France to make the white wine at Chateau Raoul for the Evans Wine Company, which again was a huge hit wine with my own yeast that I separated from over there. But we made the wines from the Clare Riesling, the Coonawarra Cabernet and Shiraz, and of course the Petaluma Chardonnay. And they all became Petaluma. We made an agreement with Len that the company would be called Petaluma and the Coonawarra would become Petaluma Coonawarra and the Riesling would become Petaluma Rhine Riesling, it used to be in those days. And that started a very, very successful wine company. Meanwhile, we were starting to plant Chardonnay at the winery site, which was on our selected Piccadilly Valley 25-acre piece of land. But we knew it was a long time before we'd get fruit, at least 3 to 4 years, and before we had enough to fulfill our ambitions, it was going to be at least a 10-year haul. So having the winery and having these other vineyards, the Riesling at Clare and the Cabernet at Coonawarra, was a godsend. Until the man that was financing all of this was a man called Peter Fox, and he was a tax lawyer in Sydney, and he was financing the Evans Wine Company for Len, including the French Chateau, including Rothbury and the Hunter, including our winery and the vineyards. And in early 1981, late 1981, he was killed in a car crash in New South Wales, and the whole thing was put into administration. So this became, sort of like, I think, what do you call it? Chapter 24 or yeah. So fortunately, Anne and I still owned the Petaluma brand, and we owned the inventory. We didn't own the Clare or the Coonawarra vineyard, but we did own our own Chardonnay vineyard that we were starting. They owned the winery. So I recruited a friend in Western Australia called Dennis Horgan, who started Lewin Estate and was working with Robert Mondavi and Tim Mondavi in a venture in the Margaret River called Lewin Estate, which is recognised as Australia's best Chardonnay by some people. It's a very, very good Chardonnay. I have my own opinion about that, but he's a very good friend, as is Lewin Estate to this day. And he organised to buy the two vineyards, the Clare and Coonawarra vineyard and the winery out of the bankrupt Empire, the Evans Wine Company. I persuaded Len to become part of it. We all put in $10,000 each to pay for $2 million for the assets. And we marched on as Petaluma with 3 shareholders, Dennis, Len and myself. I was determined to keep Len alongside. A, he had such a good collection of wines, and B, he was a certain avenue to the public in terms of publicising our wines and their qualities. Another shareholder, a friend of Dennis, has joined, so it was a 4-way shareholding up until 1984. Now, in the meantime, Roland had been working for me over here as a winemaker at Vintage, and I think he came 3 times. And on the last time, which I think was 1983, he went back to Tacoma, Washington, made fruit wine, but he wanted to go to Oregon. His heart was set on doing something in Oregon. So I said, look, we had a hugely successful consulting company in Australia called Enotech that I ran, and with another partner called Tony Jordan, who later set up Moet & Chandon's sparkling wine facility in Victoria. He'd been a lecturer with me at Charles Sturt at Riverina College, as it was called then. I said, why don't we extend this consultancy to Oregon, and you can go, all of the Enotech technology, so you can go and sell it in Oregon, which he duly went back to try and do that. And unfortunately for him, Oregon was very imbued with Burgundy and had nothing to do with Australian technology. It was all about what the Burgundians were doing in the winery, not in the vineyard. They were certainly, the Oregon vineyards weren't Burgundian at all at that point. After a year of that, I visited him, and we had decided that we would set up a winery. We'd set up and make sparkling wine just the same way that I'd set up, and I haven't shared this with you, but at the time we established the Petaluma winery in the Piccadilly Valley at our site, which is the Tiers Vineyard. We also started a sparkling wine project. And in 1984, I went to visit with Len all the famous champagne houses that Len had decided he wanted to taste their old wines. So we went to visit them and asked them whether they want to be part of a joint venture in Australia. And we ended up with Bollinger because, in his words, the 1929 Bollinger was the best wine we tasted on the journey. This was just before Christmas, 1984. And just before Christmas, 1984, leading into 1985. Bollinger became partners, so we had a 5th shareholder, Christian Bizo was the managing director of Bollinger, became instant friend and mentor, another great mentor, one of the best in world commerce in fine wine. And I'd planted around the Piccadilly Valley up to 125 acres of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, all on close spacing, all vertical canopy, much the same as we did when we got to Oregon. I'd done all of that, and we had a whole technology evolved, including the yeast to do the tirage for the sparkling wine project, which is here called Croser. Well, very simple. In Oregon, in 1986, there were lots of vineyards that were suitable for sparkling wine that weren't suitable for table wine. They simply weren't planted with the right clones on the right spacing. Viticulture was poor. Site selection was pretty poor. But we had lots of material that could be turned into very, very good sparkling wine. So we persuaded a New York distributor who'd been the distributor of Petaluma in America, Robert Chatterton, to join us, and he would become the distributor, and we'd build the winery and make the wine. I don't know what we were going to build the winery out of, because none of us had any money. But somehow we persuaded another shareholder, Ian McNee, to join us, and Chatterton had funds. And we bought the site in Dundee, which became the Argyle winery, and we copied what we've been doing in Australia pretty much. Roland applied that same technology to starting Argyle. So I had two sparkling wine projects starting at the same time, Croser in Australia and Argyle in Oregon. Now, Alan Holstein joined us from Carl Knudsen's vineyard. He was the manager there. Carl was dead keen at that point to make sparkling wine. It had been an ambition of his on his own. He was happy to see Alan come and work for us and work part-time for him, running his wonderful vineyard. And of course, that vineyard became a source of supply for us. And Alan was very expert in choosing the right vineyards for the right purpose, i.e. the right vineyard to make a table wine Pinot, which were few and far between in those days, and the right vineyards, Chardonnay and Pinot, to make sparkling wine, and some Riesling and some table wine Chardonnay. So Alan joined us, and that was a major step forward in our viticultural ambitions. We later developed some vineyards of our own, in particular Lone Star down on the Yola Hills, as a project later. So there we are. We've got Petaluma winery back from the receivers, as we call them. That business is marching on, and Croser has started, and we've just bought an 1860s flour mill with a big wheel on the side that was put there in 1860, a big water wheel, to renovate as our sparkling wine storage, and our cellar door sales facility called the Bridgewater Mill. And why we were able to build that and renovate it was because Bollinger had become a shareholder and put in $1 million, and that $1 million instantly went to the sparkling wine project, which was the Bridgewater Mill. So there were pretty rapidly moving times in the middle of 80s through to 1990. Along the way, we had a hiccup. Chatterton decided he didn't want to be part of the sparkling wine project. Robert Chatterton in New York. He pulled a shotgun agreement, which was our original partnership agreement, said either of the partners could nominate a price that they were willing to pay for the other partner's shares. the other partner could then match that price, and that would become a reverse takeover. In other words, the person who put the price in the first place would get bought out if the other person matched the price. Well, he put a price to us, which was pretty generous given what we had on the ground. And I looked ahead and I thought, well, this will be a big hole in my life if we sell it to him. Let's find the money and let's match him, and we'll take Argyle on, and he can go and do whatever he wants to do. The other thing is, Roland and Alan really didn't get on with him very well. He was a micromanager, and I couldn't see myself leaving them in his hands. And Roland had glorified himself by buying a hamburger from Chatterton's favourite hamburger joint in Dundee, packaging it up and sending it off to the Rockefeller Centre where Chatterton had his office. So we never heard the result of that, but I don't think it improved relationships much.
That's an amazing story. Okay, so tell me about, at this point, you have a lot of things either online already, coming online, and now you're spread across the world. It's not just all kind of in your backyard. So tell me about you and yourself managing all of this and splitting your energy and efforts up among the various projects.
With difficulty, obviously, because I was making wine in France in 79 and 80. I was making wine in Napa because the Evans Wine Company extended itself to Napa and bought a property with Robert Mondavi's assistance and Andrei Chelichev's assistance. And we made wine at a winery called Souverain, or at least I made wine in 80 and 81. So those overseas, but that didn't coincide with Oregon, which was later. That came along in 86. And our first release of sparkling wine was the 1987 Argyle sparkling wine. But it did coincide with a lot of consulting I was doing here in Australia, from Western Australia to Tasmania, and everywhere in between. And it did coincide with the planting of the Piccadilly Valley Chardonnay and Pinot, and the Bridgewater Mill project and the Croser project. So a lot of balls in the air, not much time at home, as my wife keeps reminding me. But it was exciting and fulfilling, and all in the right places. Sort of our vineyards were in the right cool places to grow good Chardonnay and good Pinot Noir and make good sparkling wine and table wine. So it was fulfilling my mind-eye picture of what we'd do while we were mulling over it in Davis. This is what we wanted to do. And so despite the difficulties, that's what we ended up doing.
So you've
Couldn't have
described
it any other way.
just the way to do it. So you've described kind of your initial impressions of Oregon, of the wines here, and of the viticulture here. Tell me a little bit about as you started spending time here, and as you started looking for a place to buy and for vineyards to source from. Tell me about your impressions of the industry here, the people making wine, the people buying wine, all of that, and if you saw a bright future for it at the time.
Yeah, well, when we came, we weren't looking at the best vineyards because they were being used by other people. We were looking at what was available, and we gradually got, through Alan, entree to some much better vineyards on much better sites. And it was quite obvious that the Jory soils over basalt were really the prime spots, from the Yola Hills right through to the Dundee Hills and Chehalem Mountains as well. And we had sites all up and down that we leased, basically. So we ran them, and the fruit was ours, and we paid a lease fee. And that, of course, improved the viticulture enormously. But the big step forward was taken when Roland and I discussed what was going to happen at the Knudsen vineyard, which was planted on the fairly traditional spacing. I want to say 10 feet between rows and 5 feet between vines. And I'd already planted a lot of vineyard in Australia on 7 feet by 5 feet, much narrower rows, spreading the buds a lot further, the same number of buds per hectare. The Winkler lesson, which is that every hectare of God's earth can subtend just a certain number of vine buds to keep the foliage in balance with the crop. You got to get that right. And in Oregon, it's quite a lot of buds per hectare because of the Jory soil and the kind climate. So close spacing was absolutely essential to spreading the buds out, getting more meters of vine row. And we practiced that, put that into application at Knudsen Vineyard first. And then, of course, we did with our own vineyard at Lone Star, and we promoted that closer spacing to other people. And later we went down to 5 by 5, which I also did in Australia. And we invented the equipment to make that work in Oregon, and I imported it into Australia. Little cut down 29 horsepower John Deere tractors that we were made specifically at the John Deere place in where you are, McMinnville. Yeah. John Deere agency, they did it. So it changed a lot over time. And of course, one of the big factors was, and we discovered it much to our sorrow, was at Jim Morrish's property up on the Dundee Hills. There were these big circles of dead vines, and I looked at it, and I'd just been through the experience of discovering it in one of my wineries in Australia. And it was phylloxera. And we got it analysed, and it was phylloxera. And that changed, but that was in the 90s, and that changed viticulture in Oregon positively, with a lot of new clones, rootstocks, different planting spacing. Drone came in, even closer spacing, all of that. So a hugely dramatic evolution of viticulture in Oregon in the time that we were there, from being pretty primitive at the beginning to being leading new world, sophisticated, manicured, thought through vineyards, right clones on the right rootstocks, and the right canopy management. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier meeting Cal Knudsen and forming that partnership. Tell me about getting to know him and getting to set up the partnership that lasted so long as the fruit source for Argyle.
Well, Carl was obviously hugely friendly with Alan. He was his mentor. He had hired him. Alan wasn't a viticulturalist by training. He was a plant physiologist, I think. But he'd recruited him, and Alan had formed a strong friendship with him and shared that friendship with Roland and me. And I first met Carl, I would say, in the late 80s, probably 80, 88, something like that. He'd already been described to me many times as being a really expert businessman, investor, and passionate about his vineyard and with an ambition to make sparkling wine. And when I met him, he was true to the picture that had been painted to me. He'd been a personal secretary to Nixon some part of his life, and I think he was head of CEO of a very big lumber company in Canada, and in the Northwest. He good friend with Bill Gates's father. They went to law school together in Washington State, and they started, I think, the Washington University Club together, which he spent a lot of time and took us there many times. So it quickly became obvious that he was a very special ally. I've always had a principle that when I bring a partner into a business, they've got to bring more than money. They've got to bring something that will improve one facet of the business, and it's quite obvious that was the case with him. So when we bought chatted it out. It was automatic that I went to him and said, "Look, we need some capital here. Do you want to become part of Argyle?" And he put together a group of very, very well-heeled Seattle business people, mainly Seattle, from Heist to the Skinners who own all of the wharf facilities in Seattle, and the owner of the Western Hotel Group. Lots of different people that put in as a group, as a syndicate. They put in funds and became part of it. And it was quite obvious that, being on site and with his wonderful experience and his contacts, he should be the chairman of Argyle, and he was. He held Roland's hand and Alan's hand, and taught me about how to go about business in America too. Very different to the business scene here in Australia. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, I had brought in a partner into my business to provide my share of the capital to the Dundee Wine Company, Argyle, who was almost as colourful as some of the characters I've described to you. He was an investor in all sorts of odd technologies. His money came out of oil in Oklahoma, an Australian by the name of Ian McNee, and he thought he'd bought from the Russian government the biggest gold deposit in the world, which is the Sohoi log in Siberia. He had invested in a hemispherical explosion chamber diesel engine that he thought would revolutionize the world. He invested in recovering gold from sewage streams, none of which worked. And despite putting in the initial capital, he couldn't keep up with what was needed to be done. And Cal managed to manage the cash flow of Argyle with Roland to get through all of that. And that was pretty tough times in the late 80s through to the early 90s, until Argyle was self-sufficient and cash flow positive. And it takes a lot of money to start up a sparkling wine business, because you've got a lot of inventory tied up in bottle. It's not like a table wine business where it's in bulk. It's in bottle, and you've got to hold it on lease, and so the capital, it's very capital intensive. But once you get there, it's pretty good business. And Carl was just wonderful at managing that. I was grateful from being back here in Australia. It's a long way away to Oregon to deal with those day-to-day problems.
So tell me about the initial reaction when Argyle wine hit the market. What was the reaction in Oregon? What was the reaction in the market? Were people excited for Oregon sparkling wine? Was it a mystery? What was the kind of the reaction? How long did it take for it to catch on?
Caught on pretty quickly. I think we got very strong support from Wine Spectator, and I suspect from Parker as well. And from Decanter. It was noted that the sparkling wine project had started because I was involved, and I was starting a sparkling wine project in Australia. So that was all. And if you want somebody to tell the world about how good you are, Roland Sol's perfect for that. He is a great publicist. He sprouted the story very well and worked very hard at it. And the wines were good. They were very good. They were a step up. And this is before Rotaro had started down in Anderson Valley. And in fact, I think there was only 2 sparkling wine projects in California at that time, and that would have been Domaine Chandon and the Mum project. But it was about the same time that those others started. Yeah. But it was recognized that Oregon was the right place to grow sparkling wine fruit. So it wasn't a hard sell.
So tell me about the growth of Argyle, the brand, and also the growth you saw in Oregon, because obviously you came in right as it was about to take off.
Yep.
right at the same time as the Drouins and everybody else at kind of
Yep.
the tail end of the early part of Oregon wine. So tell me about the growth and evolution of the brand and
Uh, uh,
of Oregon.
I've reflected on that, and I wasn't a very good witness to all of the other developments in the Oregon wine industry, which were enormous at that time. I was with Drouin because I was actually on the Drouin board, Dreyfus Ashby in New York, where Christian Bizot was a partner with Drouin at that point of time in that American distribution. So I was really quite close to Robert Drouin and his project, and Alan was the consultant to that. So I knew exactly what was going on there, and we had very good relations. But all of the other new ventures around Oregon, I wasn't really familiar with, because I would come into Oregon maybe 3 times a year, and I would just be focused on Argyle and then get back to doing what I was doing in Australia, leaving Alan and Roland to. I regret that I didn't spend more time familiarizing myself with the rest of the Oregon wine industry and them with me. I really regret that. But I was too busy, and I'll tell you why I was too busy. Apart from all the things we've just talked about, in 1992, we decided to take Petaluma public and raise funds from through the stock market and purchase some other wine companies. And part of that ambition for me was to join Argyle up with Petaluma. Very much an ambition that I had right from almost day one, but it just wasn't possible because my Petaluma shareholders were very, very skeptical about what was going on in Oregon, and they didn't really want me to be part of it. In fact, Dennis Organ, the man who saved us out of the hands of the receivers, he left the company and sold his shares to the rest of us, the other shareholders, because he thought that it was a conflict of interest for me to be involved in Oregon and in Petaluma at the same time. He didn't really like that. The other shareholders were quite sanguine about it, and Bollinger, in fact, Christian came and visited us, and as did Arnaud Dotefy from Bollinger. They were very interested in Oregon and tried to get into the Oregon industry independently quite a few times, and finally bought Ponzi recently. When I say recently, in the last 5 or 6 years. But I was starting a public company, and that's a lot of work. And we were taking over other companies, including Knapstein Wines in Clare, which was the first, and then Mitchelton Wines in Victoria, which is where I got my first Riesling grapes from for Petaluma. Then Stonia Wine on the Mornington Peninsula, a Chardonnay Pinot venture. Finally, Smithbrook in Western Australia, Cabernet Merlot, Cab Franc, Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon venture. So I was running quite a big company, satisfying shareholders, and at the same time darting backwards and forwards from Oregon. And finally, in 1999, I got my shareholders in Petaluma, to my board in Petaluma, to agree to purchase Argyle. So it took 15 years, 14 years, but finally I managed to do it. And we took over Argyle, and everybody who'd been part of Argyle went their way with a big pocket full of money and shares, which turned into even more money, in the sense that not only I'd only just put Argyle into Petaluma, and along came Lion Nathan, very big company in Australia, backed by Kirin Brewery in Japan, in fact owned by Kirin. And they made an offer my shareholders couldn't refuse for Petaluma. So in one fell swoop in 2001, I lost Argyle and I lost Petaluma.
How did that hits fast? How did that feel? How did you react to that?
Well, I was 53 years old and had the rest of my life planned out. I was going to be running Petaluma, including Argyle, refining our vineyards, refining our wine styles, because that's what I was really interested in. All the business was just a means to an end, means to an end to get a sustainable a fine wine company going forward so that we could grow good grapes and make good wine. Grow great grapes and make great wine was really the ambition. So it was a pretty hollowed out experience for me. And I did try and fight it, but even my most loyal shareholders, because we controlled between us about 40% of the company, which wasn't quite enough. Bollinger and a Spanish friend of mine who owns all the newspapers in Spain. And I thought Colin Ryan, who'd become the fourth shareholder way back when Dennis Horgan bought us out. I thought all of those people would stand firm, but the offer that was made was 33 or 34 times earnings, and it would take, a decade for me to get there. And they all said, yeah, that's not going to happen. Well, it didn't happen, so we sold the company. I stayed in as winemaker for Petaluma until 2005, but my heart wasn't in it. The winery down the bottom of the hill, which is my winery, was now owned by Lion Nathan, even though we owned the vineyard and the house above it. And I really didn't like going down there. It's my winery originally, and I love going there, but I didn't want to go there. So we set about doing some different things, and one of the first things we did was come back to Oregon, and we bought a 50-acre Christmas tree farm in the Yola Hills overlooking Salem. See Salem from it. It's right on the gap, the Van Duzer corridor, breaking through the coastal range on a steep slope, relatively steep slope, right next to Christian Winery, above and next to Christian Winery, right next to Xena Crown Vineyard, which wasn't there. It came along after we bought the 58 hectares. We proceeded to take out 60,000 Christmas trees one by one, and plant some Riesling in the first instance and some Pinot in the second. Pinot was sold to Christum, and the Riesling we made ourselves at Christum, while I was building a cold room winery, which has another story. A very prolonged process because of the electricity supply constraints. And we made, I think, 8 vintages of Tunkalilla Vineyard, as it was called, Riesling. Tunkalilla is the name of a beach where I have a house here in South Australia, so we transferred the name back to Oregon, sort of tit for tat. We stole Petaluma from California and gave Oregon Tunkalilla. Yeah, so that's pretty much that story. But I started another company called Tapanapa, just to fill the gap of that Petaluma had left behind. Tapanapa we started in 2003. I invited Bollinger and Jean-Michel Caz of Lynchbarge to be partners in it. We were a 3-way partnership. Again, along my theory, everybody's got to have something to offer. Well, you can't have 2 better partners than Bollinger and Lynchbarge in the business of selling fine wine around the globe. Tapanapa, we bought a Cabernet and Cabernet Franc and Merlot vineyard in the southeast, 3.5 hours south, just north of Coonawarra in the Rattenbully area. I had my vineyards in the Piccadilly Valley, the tiers we owned, and I planted a Pinot vineyard in a place where no grapes have ever been planted, on the Fleurieu Peninsula, looking at Kangaroo Island on a very high slope back to the Great Southern Ocean. Perfect place for Pinot. Low region 1, about 1 metre of rainfall on very invigorating soil. So really good maritime climate for Pinot. Tapanapa is based on that Pinot. Foggy Hill Pinot is based on our original Tiers vineyard, Chardonnay, which is, I think, Australia's best, which is why I was reticent about Lewin. So those three wines, the Cabernet Merlot from the Whalebone Vineyard at Rattonbully, there's a cave underneath with a 34 million year old skeleton of a whale in the wall of the cave underneath the vineyard. So Whalebone Vineyard, Cabernet Merlot, Cabernet Franc, the Pinot from Foggy Hill on the Fleurieu Peninsula, and the Chardonnay from the wonderful old Thiers vineyard here in the Piccadilly Valley, the vineyard we planted in 79. In the meantime, my wife had trained as an accountant and a lawyer, and as well as being a microbiologist, and she found a way of denying Alain Nathan the road to the winery, except on strict license basis, and they decided that they would sell the winery back to us. So we got the winery back. Not the wine business, just the winery at the bottom of the garden. So I can go there again.
It's the little victories, you know.
It is. As I've summarized about my life in the end chapter of my memoir, there are 30 things that I did that I think are worth putting on a score sheet. And they're either success or failure. Some of them are pending. One of them is a draw. Out of the 30 things that I've done, which include most of the things we just talked about, I've got about a 60% pass rate.
I think that's all any of us can hope for in the end.
I did have another life, which is my industry life and my university life. My industry life, while all this was going on, was setting up the Small Winemakers Forum so that small winemakers could have a voice in Australian wine politics. And then joining up with all the big ones, forming 3 colleges, the co-ops, the cooperatives, the big companies and our small company colleges, 3 of them, and forming the Winemakers Federation. And I fought government on tax. I was president of that organisation twice. And I saw the massive growth of the Australian wine industry from 1986, but really accelerating in about 1992 through to 2005. Huge growth, like annual growth rates of 30%, export and domestic combined. And we nearly trebled the amount of grape in the vine, in the ground in Australia over that time period, 95 to 2005 in particular. So I was part of that, organising it, fighting government on tax, setting up research and development arrangements for the industry. But the big companies finally took over management of the fast-moving consumer guys who came in on 3-year, 5-year CEO cycles, who knew nothing about wine and fine wine, swamped the whole organisation. So I left it in 1999 and went off to the university to become the Deputy Chancellor there to help run the university, and appointed a friend of mine as the Chancellor. So we did that and set up the National Wine Centre in 2001. That was opened up, which became part of the university, but now houses all of the wine industry organisations. Just helped run the university for 8 years.
That's incredible. That's an incredible amount of work. Tell me about, from those 2 things, what do you consider the biggest accomplishments working with the small winemakers and on the education side? What are the biggest accomplishments?
So the biggest accomplishment was, I think, the National Wine Centre, putting all of them bodies together and getting that owned by the university. I didn't do that. That was done by the Chancellor behind my back, but I applaud him for doing it. And getting the finances of the university back in shape and getting them focused on grape and wine, R&D and education. Very, very important things. I have tried desperately for nearly 30 years, certainly nearly 40, to get clear recognition in our industry that we're in fact not one industry, we're two industries. We're a fine wine industry in the cooler areas with 2,500 winemakers and a whole lot of complexity, terroirs, and a whole lot of the right varieties in the right places, the right sites. That industry, as opposed to what I call the branded commodity industry, which is all the inland, highly irrigated, high productivity vineyards that make the Yellowtails and the Jacobs Creek and the Canunga Hills and all of those branded commodity wines. Two separate industries, two different sets of consumption pattern, two different requirements in R&D and in promotion. I've won the battle at various times and lost it again, and right now I'm losing it again. There is a conflation of the two by the industry currently. I left the board of Wine Australia, which is our body that funds the R&D and funds promotion, and they've gone back from a fine wine strategy back to a one sector strategy, which is basically combining and conflating the two sorts, branded commodity and fine wine. I think that's a tragedy. It's a 40-year tragedy. We've lost the opportunity to go out and compete with the best in the world, the French, the Spanish, the Italians, which, and for that matter, the Oregonians and the Californians. We've lost those 30 to 40 years. But on the other hand, I think we've incrementally made gains, like water dripping on stone. Even after it stops, there's a little dent there that shows where it's been dripping, and I think we've made that dent, and that sometime not in the too distant future, that strategy will be adopted again.
So one of the things that was kind of a recurring theme throughout our conversation today was your desire to be hands-on, making wine, not just directing winemaking, but making wine. So tell me, I'm curious about from when you first got into winemaking to now. Tell me about your sort of winemaking philosophy or strategy, and has it changed? Does the way you approach wine and what you want the final result in the bottle to be, has that changed, and how would you describe it?
It has changed, and it's changed back again. First of all, vineyard has been number one for me from the very first moment I stepped into the industry. The choice of site, choice of planting spacing, getting the right variety for the site, or getting the right site for the variety. That's been number one. And I guess the whole philosophy of my winemaking has followed on from that, which is, why do you go to all that effort and expense if you're going to take those grapes into the winery and mutate them and change them and obscure the native fruit character that your terroir and the variety contribute? Why do it? So trust the vineyard is really the core philosophy. And at the end of it, it is somebody else can't make Tier's Chardonnay unless they own that piece of land, the Tier's vineyard. That's core philosophy. That's the definition of terroir. And that's from day one. And it's still very, very much central for me now. That's an interesting journey in a winemaking sense, because I went to Davis having made only Riesling as a noble white variety. And the only way to make Riesling in Australia was to be absolutely protective. Now, I'm not going to say anaerobic, and I'm not going to say reductive. They're the words of, they're weasel words. This is protective winemaking. Take the fruit out of the vineyard and do everything you can to protect the native fruit character. Chill the grapes, crush them gently, press them gently, extract the cold juice, Um, add a little bit of sulfur dioxide as protectant, but add a stream of nitrogen as it goes into the tank to take out any oxygen that's picked up in the crushing, pressing process. End up with an anaerobic juice with very low phenols because it's been so cold fruit, gently pressed. And then just make the wine clean yeast fermentation, own yeast, which I grow. I don't use packaged yeast. I grow them with a special yeast technology I developed way back at Hardy's a long time ago and at Charles Sturt University. And then bottle anaerobically. So you end up with all of the native fruit character. You end up with reasonably low phenolic because of the extraction process. And I like that little bit of phenolic anyway. The opposite was exactly what Zomalong and all my mates at Davis did with Chardonnay, which was process it at ambient temperature, make sure it gets heavy oxidation so that the phenols that you're going to extract lots of because it's at ambient temperature, they drop out. And then you can start making the wine without fear of oxidative browning or without fear of having a wine that's too tannic. But you've lost something along the way. You've lost that freshness of fruit character that comes out of the vineyard that my philosophy protects. And another point of departure between me and my Riesling process versus Chardonnay process of Californians. Californians, and these are great friends of mine, Dave Ramey, and he did a whole series of papers with Corneo on that, just that juice oxidation, chilling grapes, doing all of the comparisons. Comes with malolactic or not, stirring lees or not, how much new yolk or not. And they're what I call the non-vineyard patina. They are the additions to the complexity of the wine to make it look more and more like white Burgundy. So it depends on what you want to do. Do you want to start out with a muted native fruit character and add all these other things and end up with something that vaguely resembles a white Burgundy? I mean, Chardonnay has one overriding quality that no other white variety has, and probably very few red varieties have. And that's mouthfeel. It has a viscosity, it has a sweet fruit mouthfeel that's significant, which other varieties don't have. It also has a fruit complexity, native fruit complexity that is very hard to describe, and you can range from green apple and cucumber to nectarine and white peach to yellow peach to fig and honey, depending on the degree of ripeness and the place where it's grown. But it is pretty hard to describe, and that's a quality, because complexity is a thing that keeps interested wine people interested, teasing out what this wine's about, what this variety's about. So it's a remarkable variety. So I went through that process of full malolactic, lee stirring, 70% new oak, and finally decided that I didn't really want my native fruit character covered up by that much. So you guess where I am today? No malolactic, no lee stirring, 30% new oak, and still totally protective juice extraction. Couldn't be happier. Full circle.
That's amazing. I love the description of protective. That's amazing. I'm gonna remember that. I've never heard that before. Um, I'm curious about you mentioned, obviously you said to me before the interview, but also you mentioned during the interview that you've worked on a memoir. Tell me about the inspiration to do that and about the process of writing a memoir.
The inspiration to do it was my wife was going to chuck out all my records if I didn't do it. So I needed to protect them. No, I've been lucky in a number of ways. I've always had a very good secretary when I ran my company, personal assistant to organise my papers, a lot of correspondence. A lot of newspaper, magazine articles, a lot of diaries, not really descriptive diaries, just who I met when. So that's been helpful. But the most helpful thing of all is that over the past 40 years, I've written something like 300 articles, speeches. So at any point of time from about 1981 forward, I can reach for a paper that tells me exactly what I was thinking at that point of time. And that's been extraordinarily helpful. And I've quoted a lot from those papers over time. And as I say, my philosophy hasn't changed. Yeah.
That's incredible. When does the memoir come out?
It's just gone to the publisher. So they tell me that the editorial process is brutal and that I should get ready for it. So I have 204 typewritten pages, 100,000 words. I'm wondering where it's going to end up at. And then, of course, I've got all of the bibliography to do and find the photographs. And again, I'm lucky because my wife has kept photographs all through our married life. And I do have, professionally, we've had photographers work in our businesses all through. So I've got a very good library of photographs. Not such a good one from Oregon, actually. I'm not a very good photographer. I'm very spasmodic taking photographs. They're not very good, but which is a pity because that's where I would have got the photographs for Oregon. But I'm sure Roland and Alan have got a lot. I know Alan's written a book and he's got some lovely photographs in that.
Absolutely, he does. Tell me a little bit about the wine industry today, as you look at it in Australia, in the U.S., and in the world. Where is the industry right now? What are the biggest challenges in wine right now that you see? And
Well,
what
I don't think
are
I've ever seen the global industry more challenged. We've always lived on an upward curve, hockey stick growth curve for wine. But what I have noticed a long time ago and tracked is the difference between branded commodity wine and fine wine. And branded commodity wine has been going backwards now for a number of decades, 3 decades, 2.5 decades. Whereas fine wine has kept on growing at about the same rate that branded commodities going backwards, about 2.5%. So a big differential between the two. But there's a lot more branded commodity than there is fine wine in volume terms around the world. And all of a sudden, with changing consumer patterns, that differential has become even more important, more obvious. And everywhere you look now, there are vines coming out of the ground, whether it's Italy, Spain, France, California. I don't think in Oregon, but certainly in Washington. Australia, more should be coming out than is coming out. More grapes coming out of the ground in Chile, but they're all basically branded commodity grapes, headed for the branded commodity side. My optimism, my faith in the fine wine mission is absolute. I look at it this way, that the consumers want that complexity, want that sophistication, want as wine as part of their lives, despite the health warnings, despite the different alternative alcoholic beverages and non-alcoholic beverages. There is a place for fine wine as a cultural adjunct to life. And it's evident in the growth rates of fine wine. I can't think of any other industry that has so many advocates. Around the globe, if you look at, there's 2,500 small winemakers in Australia. There would be, how many in Oregon? There'd have to be 800, 700, something like that.
There's
On the west coast of them.
a thousand
Yep.
total brands in Oregon now, and most of those are pretty small. So yeah.
Yeah, yep. And the west coast of America, probably 5,000 total, maybe more. France, Spain, Italy, tens of thousands, all selling their messages, which is, we're different. Makes it a hard business to be in. It's a fantastically fragmented business, but I can't think of a better cohort of publicists than all those small winemakers. And then you look at the bibliography, look at the number of books printed, the number of magazines, the number of blogs, websites. It's hugely promoted, fine wine. That's not going to go away. And look at all the other products that are trying to emulate it, whether it's coffee or beer or even whiskey, where different barleys from different soil types and different islands in Scotland and Ireland being used to differentiate different malts. And we've got an experiment going on here in the Piccadilly Valley with malt for beer from different locations, different terroirs. They're all trying to copy what we're doing, because what comes naturally to the wine and fine wine industry, because that's where it was invented, the difference between two sites. To make that wine, you've got to own that vineyard.
It's an interesting perspective. Thank you for sharing that. I have one question left for you, and that is, tell me, what is your proudest accomplishment, biggest achievement as you look back? What are you proudest of?
My family, quite obviously, all very functional human beings, contributors, lifters, not leaners, all very highly educated. And we made a promise to our girls, we have 3 girls, that following our experience at Davis, that they would only have to nominate somewhere they wanted to go in the world to study, and we would pay for them to do it. Well, they did it, not once, but twice and 3 times each. And we have a long list of institutions, universities around the world that we've made contributions to over the years. And they have 8 amazing, well, they've got 3 amazing husbands, including one who's the son of Christian Bizo of Bollinger, who married my middle daughter. So the 2 families got together in that sense. So we've got these lovely sons-in-law and 8 beautiful grandchildren who we all live together in within 2 miles of one another in the Piccadilly Valley. We all live on vineyards, and the 3 girls all live adjacent to one another. We had nothing to do with that. I mean, we had a little bit to do with it, but not much. They chose to do that. So that's by far the biggest accomplishment. If the things I loved teaching, I loved my time at Wagga, Anderton. I did do some secondary school teaching before that. And I love my time at the university, and I love being involved in education and R&D, research and development, as well as obviously passionate about my vineyards.
That's a lot to be proud of. Congratulations on a life well lived. All the questions that I have for you.
I hope there's a bit to go yet.
It's true. So far. It's a so far. Always a so far. All the questions that I have for you, is there anything that I didn't ask that I should have, anything we didn't cover today that you wanted to cover?
Not that I can think of. I've tried to give you a fairly broad snapshot of the whole thing, but there are a lot of things happening a lot of moving parts and a lot of things happening at one time. I'm sure we've left some gaps, but anyway, you can come back to me anytime if you want. So, yeah.
I appreciate that, and I may just do that.
Yeah, and my memoir is probably a year off printing, so we'll see.
Something to look forward to. Thank you so much for joining us today, taking the time to share your story, and we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Thanks, Rich. Nice to talk to you.